So watch what you say, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
My wife has good
In
taste.
the interest of time, and everybody here today, thanks everybody for coming. And Gwen, thanks for being here with us. Our speaker today is Gwen Holdmann. Gwen is the director of Alaska Center for Energy and Power, known as ACEP, which is an applied energy research program based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, focusing on both fossil and renewable and alternative energy technologies. ACEP is highly interdisciplinary program, which over 30 affiliates spanning a wide range of energy and related disciplines. And there's a whole couple other paragraphs, but in the interest of time, and since we know her, Gwen, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Great. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come here, and it's so fun to see a whole bunch of faces in the room that ACEP has been really involved with over the years, and in particular, the two guys in the corner in the back there are pretty instrumental, really, in getting the Alaska Center for Energy and Power launched 11 years ago. I don't know, it's been quite a while, but you know, the idea with this program was really to take a little bit of a different approach to how the university conducted research and more generally conducted business with regards to the needs of the state and sort of the areas that we wanted to focus on and emphasize. So the idea was that energy research has been done at the university for a very long time, maybe since the university was founded over 100 years ago. And what we wanted to do was really take that basic knowledge that we had and the different skill sets that the university had and really apply them to the sorts of energy challenges that were really facing Alaskans on a day-to-day basis in our communities, in our individual residences, you know, what that really looked like and what the university could provide in terms of value. And so we really just started with an idea. Brian you were not chancellor when ACEP was formed, but I think that you started very shortly after that, and he was a really big proponent for building the program. We really started with no budget, and that's where Steve came in, and we worked very closely with the Alaska Energy Authority and looked for ways that we could support the energy agency in terms of energy planning and a lot of the programs that were being launched at that period of time. This was back in 2008. That was during that time where we had those real spikes in fuel oil prices that really impacted Alaska pretty significantly. And that really also created a lot of the reason for why ACEP picked the initial focus areas that we did, which was really very much kind of looking initially at sort of rural challenges around at high energy costs and the potential for integrating different kinds of energy sources. And so today ACEP's grown pretty significantly. I want to introduce Amanda Bird. She's one of our staff members there. She's in charge of outreach, but actually her title is Chief Storyteller, and I think that this is important because, you know, I think that what we need to do is do a better job sort of telling the stories that both the university can tell in terms of the value of the research that we're doing, but also really tell stories from the community. And that's one of the things that Amanda's been doing really effectively. I'm going to show one of the videos that she put together, kind of showing about what's kind of happening in a particular community in Alaska, but we really consider Fairbanks to really be the sort of the central focus area for a lot of the energy challenges and the research that we're doing here, not just with ACEP, but also with the Cold Climate Housing Research Center and other programs at the university. And of course, like the long-term leadership of Jim and FEDC in working on energy challenges for our community and for Alaska more broadly. So, so this is something that I just thought would be fun to share toward the end here. So most of you are familiar with the fact that we have this energy technology facility. It's sort of a real state-of-the-art facility. In fact, last week we had guests visiting from Canada, I think, and we actually ran the lab at full power levels and kind of worked it through like how things might actually happen in the real world in terms of power generation and some of the challenges that you face if you're trying to bring together different energy sources on sort of a weak grid, a small grid. And a small grid might be a rural community, or it could be here in Fairbanks as well. You know, we have a lot of those similar challenges. It's just sort of the magnitude at which we're sort of facing those. So, you know, we are using that lab for field testing, for really kind of hardening of technologies and of strategies for largely for integrating renewables and displacing fossil fuels where that's possible, but also really looking at how equipment can respond to things like, for example, faults in the system. That's one thing that our utility partners are really interested in, is that if you have an unexpected fault in the system, how can equipment recover from that? And so that's an example of something that we can actually do in the lab now at full power levels. And I think that we're one of the only laboratories in the country that has those sorts of capabilities. We do a lot of research across a broad range of different topics. I think I have a slide that kind of talks a little bit about some of that. We're also really looking at how we can kind of commercialize innovation in the energy space. Where are there opportunities for the university and for Alaskans to be pushing the envelope? I feel like we push the envelope all the time here in Alaska because we need to. How can we actually leverage that into opportunities to commercialize technologies that might have a broader marketable potential in other places as well? Sharing knowledge. You know, at the end of the day, what we need to do is be successful in terms of sharing the information and the knowledge that we're gaining with our stakeholders in Alaska. Come on in, join us.
There's some chairs here. There's two right here.
Oh, we got three.
That may be the broken one, so watch
We
it.
actually have 3 chairs. Come on in.
Yeah. So part of that sharing of knowledge is about sharing information about potential technologies that may have some really provide an opportunity in Alaska for potentially realizing energy savings with vendors or developers that may be coming from other places or maybe Alaska-based, or making sure that community members are aware of potential opportunities that are out there that they may be able to take advantage of. So I'll just introduce really quickly Matt Carter, if you don't mind, and Bob Gershon. Am I saying that right? Okay. Yeah, and so they're with Carter Wind Energy, and so they're an example of a company that's been really interested in the Alaska market. And so we've been working with them to make sure that they have kind of a clear understanding or picture of what sort of the challenges are that we have here and the potential opportunity that they have to sort of fit into a niche space here in Alaska. Their wind turbine technology, for example, uses a tilt-down tower, which is pretty appealing for areas where bringing a crane in is pretty expensive. And so we're sort of working with them to help, figure out how their technology solution really might fit into the sort of space the need space that we have here in Alaska. So I invited them to join us today because I told them that there was a lot of real thought leaders in the Fairbanks area in energy, and so thank you for joining us at the last minute here. Yeah. And then the last bullet here, workforce development, STEM student engagement. Again, we are part of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and so that education mission is really important and key to us. And so one of the things, for example, that we're doing right now is we have an intern program where we're placing a number of interns from the university here, but also Alaskan students that are studying at other universities outside the state with the utility industry here in Alaska. Because what we want to see is that our young people recognize that there's really cool opportunities in the utility industry here in Alaska to be really doing leading edge things, because there's a lot of pretty interesting things happening here. So that's another really big focus area for us. Similarly, we had, as I mentioned before, we had a group of Canadian leaders. It was an International Visitor Leadership Program, is that right? That also came from Northern Canada, from Northern Canadian communities here to Fairbanks. So they spent, a couple days here in Fairbanks. We took them out to Chena Hot Springs. we spun up the lab for them. We were able to provide them with opportunities to engage with a lot of local leaders that had information that that was relevant to what they're doing, both folks from the university, but also, for example, like David Polonius Messier with Canada Chiefs Conference that are doing a lot of pretty interesting things in the region, obviously, and you've heard from before here. So that's a pretty cool thing. This is a group of like 10 Canadians that came here to Alaska, spent time in Fairbanks because they view us as being an area where there's a lot of energy expertise that's sort of consolidated in one geographic area. They can learn from us here. Then they went down to Anchorage for a day or something like that, and then out to Kotzebue as well. So anyway, those are some of the things that ACEP is generally engaged in. More specifically, these are some examples of the types of projects that we've done over the past decade. You'll notice that it's really very much sort of, a lot of them are pretty topical based. There are things like, for example, small modular nuclear reactors. More recently, there's been more interest going toward micro reactors. And this is something that there's been a real interest in Alaska in the evolution of this technology over time. And so we have made it our business to stay up to date on the evolution of that particular industry, the technology, and making sure that the industry and potential developers of those systems are really aware of Alaska use cases so that they're keeping us in mind and sort of the circumstances that we have up here as they're kind of going through some of the early stages for design and permitting and things like that. Those are the kinds of things we are doing. So, for example, we had a workshop on micro reactors down in Anchorage about a month ago or so, and then followed up with a presentation to the legislature, again, just providing information to let them know, what the evolution of that technology is. Not something that you can buy off the shelf today, so it's not something anyone can or should make decisions around, but we need to be keeping track of that, and I think an organization like ACEP is well positioned to do that. These are the three areas that we've actually worked to actually build additional capacity over the last several years. The first one, power systems integration. This was a really big area for us where we recognized pretty early on, and actually in my work prior to coming to the university, that the challenge of integrating different sorts of energy sources with different loads on a small grid is not to be underestimated. And so, for example, Matt has a widget, a wind turbine, and you want to integrate it into a small grid, and you really need to think about how to do that in ways that actually fits within that environment, and doing that in a way that actually meets your objectives of displacing fuels and things like that, getting to maximize the use of that resource. And so that's something that we've made it our business to be real experts in. And I've got a slide here, a couple slides in a minute, that sort of shows why Alaska has this, both this unique set of circumstances. We have our entire grid is based around microgrids. And we think about rural Alaska as being these sort of isolated individual microgrids, but the truth is our entire rail belt is actually built up around interlinked microgrids too. And so there's no one in the world that has more expertise around microgrids and the challenges around integrating different kinds of energy sources in a microgrid environment than Alaskans. We're literally number one in the world in this area, and I think that means that we both need to continue to push the envelope for ourselves, but it provides us an opportunity to really be a place where we can actually export knowledge and expertise around the kinds of solutions that are working for us here to other places. River hydrokinetics, this was actually a really early program that ACEP started up because there was a lot of interest in our communities and from vendors coming in from outside of Alaska about placing turbines directly in the moving currents in our waterways in Alaska. And most of our communities are on some sort of a waterway, whether it's the ocean or a village. And so how can you actually extract energy directly from that moving water to benefit a community? And there was a real evolution in the technology about 10 years ago, and a lot of vendors that were interested in the Alaska space. So we wanted to make sure that the vendors had good information about what the potential applications in Alaska were, and then also making sure that the communities recognized, you know, what the state of the technology was and what a successful project could potentially look like. And so we're continuing to work in that space. There's a permanent project going into Igiagik in the Kwijak River and Lake Iliamna this summer, and we have a test bed in Nenana that we continue to operate to actually test turbines, and we have continued to also work in our laboratory on the integration of these sorts of devices into a grid, into an electric grid. So that's an area that we're sort of considered to be have some leadership in. And then the last one is actually a new area for us, solar energy at high latitudes. For a long time, I sort of maintained the position that solar is a mature technology and there's not a lot of research that needs to be done around that. But our research team has convinced me that there are still some interesting questions that need to be answered. We actually have a test array at the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus that tests different sorts of panel types in the sorts of environment that we have here in Alaska, and including like bifacial arrays where you're actually collecting solar energy on both sides of the panel. And that we expect is going to be a pretty successful strategy in a high latitude environment where you've got the sun, you know, sort of going around at multiple angles, and also having a lot of opportunities for capturing, you know, albedo effects and bouncing of light off of the snow during spring months and things like that. So that's the kind of work that we're doing. I'm just rambling on, so if anyone wants to like interrupt me, here's a picture of our test site in Nenana. In this case, we're testing a turbine from Oceana. There's a couple, I think, of points that are sort of relevant to this group and to this community here. The manufacturer Oceana is based in Annapolis, Maryland. They had no connections to Alaska before getting involved with us with this turbine testing. This was funded through the Alaska Energy Authority Emerging Energy Technology Grant Fund. They had some partners that they'd identified in Alaska, and they proposed to work with ASAP to test this technology at our test site. And once we completed this testing, we then worked with them to actually do the integration testing in our laboratory with their generator to understand like how we would actually, because a lot of people think of river current energy as being a very consistent source of energy, but it's actually pretty variable. There's a lot of turbulence and a lot of small changes all the time, and so it's actually more like wind energy than you would think necessarily. And so how you're actually integrating that onto a grid requires a couple of additional steps. And so we've been working on that. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, Gwen, remind us how these things are, how you're protecting the fish from getting munched.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we do is we send some, it's really not so that's a really big concern. So that's a great example. Our research is really focused around both how the turbine impacts the environment and how the environment is going to impact the turbine. Okay, because that's a two-way street. And so in the case of fish, we obviously have, we care a lot about our fish in Alaska, especially the salmon that are not just migrating upstream, but more importantly, actually the smolt that are being sort of flushed out downstream and don't have a lot of control over how they're actually traveling, you know, through the waterway, and are often going through the fastest moving part of the river, which is, and they're, you know, potentially more vulnerable to like pressure changes across the turbine and things like that. So we actually worked with the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. So this is an example of how ASAP is a really interdisciplinary team. You know, we identify a problem, something like this, that we want to figure out the answer to, and then we pull together researchers from all over the university system, some of which work with ASAP over a long period of time, some that might just come in and work with us on one project. This is an example of a long-term partnership between the College of Fisheries and Ocean Science and ASAP, and we've done numerous steps in terms of taking a look at the potential impacts to out-migrating smolt. And the biggest study that we did is we actually captured a bunch of smolt and we sent them through a turbine. And then we caught them on the backside. And this sounds trivial, but it's actually not so trivial. Like catching fish in a really fast-moving river current, small fish with a net, is actually non-trivial. And so we actually had to create a device to actually even capture fish midstream. And this is where Fish and Game was very interested in our research, because they had never themselves actually captured fish midstream. So we, first did a bit of a survey to see, what fish are, which smolt are actually there in the middle of a channel and when, at what time of year they're actually present. And then we actually did this work where we tagged them, sent them through or around or whatever, a turbine, and then captured them on the back end to look at any kind of injury, bruising, mortality, things like that. And there was about 10% injury rate to the fish, not necessarily mortality rate. And so that's something to be thinking about. And so the recommendations that we had is to really understand the patterns of smolt outmigration and not have the turbine active during the periods where there's a high number of smolt, but then understanding that they're actually traveling down the river system all through the summer. So you're always going to have some mortality rate, and understanding what an acceptable number is not our job. We're providing the information on what's happening. We're not the fisheries experts.
But if these become successful, then that becomes an issue.
It does become, these are things that we need to consider. There's always impact every technology. There are things that you need to think about, and there's trade-offs every time you make decisions. So yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yes, Gwen, TJ Simon, how do we, I'm from Malakakat on the Kaitut River. How does, tribes and then village corporations or regional corporations go on, how do we become eligible for pilot projects like you're doing in Nenana? Because on the Kaitut River, you go to Hughes, they're trying solar, but it's $8 a gallon for gasoline. I don't know what it is for diesel, but they'd be open to joint venture or partnerships or pilot projects. How do tribes or villages become eligible for such projects?
Yeah, and I'm not really, I don't know if eligible is exactly the right word. We are always looking for partners in communities. And actually Amanda she wears two hats. I introduced you as our storyteller, our chief storyteller, but she also is our lead for biomass energy. And she actually works really closely with the Alaska Energy Authority on working in a lot of the communities across the region here on opportunities for biomass energy and hosting workshops and things like that. A project like this, we selected Nenana for very specific reasons. So ASAP did select this site with industry partners, but we're working with communities all over the state on all kinds of different energy projects. So there are opportunities sometimes for a pilot project or the demonstration of a technology. And we do look for communities that are willing to partner with us. We have a close relationship with Tanana Chiefs Conference. In fact, we actually had a joint position with them for many years around energy. And really a lot of the program that they have there now was initially a joint venture, and they've done some amazing things, over the years. Hughes has a pretty big solar project that's being planned there with the potential for adding storage. And so this is part of this idea, and we're part of that project. We're more on the data collection and a little bit on the more low-key side of that, because we're not developers. One thing that's really important to us that we're not competing with private sector at any time. So if it's a project like the one in Hughes that's fairly standard technology, fairly well understood, we can provide support. We love to get data so that we can share that with others, so that everyone's learning from lessons, both positive and potentially some lessons learned in terms of how to do things better in the future. But we're not actually developers of these projects. So that's usually a project, in that case, it's funded through the Department of Energy. And Alaska Energy Authority has been a major funder of projects in the future. So we can support communities in figuring out what their options might be, but we are never developing the projects ourselves. We're not the developer.
So just following on that, you guys have contacts with Department of Indian Energy, or you guys can, if tribe says, well, doggone it, Gwen, we want you guys to look for grants for wind turbines or a hybrid energy. Would you guys be working with these communities?
If it's an innovative project and there's a research aspect to it, we could be pretty directly involved. So for example, one community that we're involved with right now is a community of Kokanock, Alaska, and they have a really interesting and innovative very high penetration wind energy project that involves turning the diesels off and running off 100% wind energy. They've had real problems with this system over time, and so we're working with them to sort of figure out a workable strategy where that system will work both for them, but where it could be replicable for other places, not just in that region, but other places in the north more broadly. And so we were able to bring some funding through, in this case, the Office of Naval Research, to the table. They're interested in microgrids, ships are microgrids, and we are able to demonstrate some strategies in this small community of Kokkinok, for example, this summer. We are a good place to we're kind of a good matchmaker. For example, right now I just found out that there's a 2-megawatt battery in Hawaii that is funded and is looking for a new home. And so now I'm like thinking, who in Alaska could use a 2-megawatt battery, right? So what's the best application for that, for example? So we can do that. I was just down in Cordova last week, and we've been really working hard with them to figure out how to reduce the amount of spilled hydro they have there. That's resulted in a project with the Office of Electricity at the federal level, and they're installing a 1-megawatt battery that actually was barged in yesterday and is being installed. And so we helped size that battery and develop the specifications for it. But now it's moving forward as just a community project. We're not involved.
So is that with Cordova Utility or with the EAC, or who is that?
EAC has been involved with that. They have a pretty close relationship with Cordova Electric Cooperative, but in this case, it was mostly the electric cooperative that was the kind of the lead point of contact there. Yeah. Yeah.
Is Cordova getting close to 100% renewable?
Well, they can do 100% renewables when they're, you know what? I have a little video segment from the load and the load in Cordova in this
Okay.
slide. So maybe I should just go forward a couple more, because there may be some more answers in here, and I may never get through this. So we've been talking a lot about these, small rural communities, but I sort of want to step back from that conversation. This is a little bit of that schematic. I show this to other people about, these are sort of very discrete, isolated systems with very discrete boundaries electrically, right? And so that's a really cool opportunity to test all kinds of different things, because as scientists or engineers know, when you sort of have like a closed, defined boundary around something, you can do some pretty interesting research and pretty interesting work. When you're working inside that boundary, it can be a lot more challenging, because the change, if you have, like, let's say a 1 kilowatt or a 10 kilowatt swing on a really tiny grid that's maybe 100 kilowatts, that's like a 10% change potentially, whereas like on a large grid, even a Golden Valley grid, it's not noticeable. And so there's a lot more challenges on a small grid with integrating badly controlled loads and sources of energy that you don't have control over. And so how do we make that happen in a way that actually results in the sorts of benefits that we're actually trying to realize, which is, at the end of the day, often in Alaska, kind of about saving money, right? I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do. We can talk about other things about, carbon, and we can talk about things like more resilient grids. But we're really, at the end of the day, a lot of this is driven by economics in the state of Alaska. Okay, here's my Cordova one. So let me just play this. This is super fun. I just love this. So this shows the load profile for a 24-hour period. So this is hour 0, midnight, and this is midnight the next morning, basically. So this is over an entire year. So it shows the date here. So this is February, and it's every single day. This blue line is every day. The gray lines are sort of residual, 5 days. This is sort of the average load for the year, this red line. This is the minimum load, and this is the maximum load. You notice we haven't gotten anywhere close there yet, but take a look at what happens. Remember, this is within a 24-hour period. Watch how this squiggly line starts to go crazy. And this is what people kind of need to understand, is that what's happening now is that the fish processors are coming online. And so the fish are being processed when the fish are being processed. Like, it's not about, oh, is there hydro right at this minute? And so what Cordova has is this really schizophrenic kind of load profile that results in them spilling hydro sometimes at night, because they only have run and river hydro, so you use it or lose it. And then during the day, oftentimes they have to turn on their diesel generator and run them in a really inefficient way to kind of capture those peaks. And so they're trying to get rid of that. And so that's really where a battery system makes a lot of sense for Cordova. so that they can kind of shift some of those peaks a little bit, those peaks and valleys in terms of production and load. But at the same time, they need to not have that storage system be so big that it's really adding to the overall cost of the system. And so that's kind of what we did, and we've created this tool called MyGrids that we've made publicly available internationally on actually doing this optimal sizing of storage systems at like very small time steps, so that a utility feels pretty confident that when you're looking at, like a larger duration, like 10 minutes or something like that, you don't know what's happening in between there, right? You might have an average of whatever amount of load, but maybe in between there you have some major peak or some major dip, and utilities need to kind of understand exactly what that looks like. And so we really developed this sort of optimal sizing tool so we can keep storage as small as possible while still trying to meet the application that we're intending it for.
In the previous slide, you showed the picture of the village.
Yeah.
And it seems like there are half a dozen flywheels off to the west.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is what happens when you got an artist. Taking a little, of course you would notice that.
Well, they're doing that in Kodiak, right?
Yes, Kodiak has 2 flywheels. So I actually took out, I had a lot of examples from specific communities in here, and I took them out because I want to focus on just 1 or 2 examples and talk about the rail belt, which is also of interest here. But yeah, Kodiak is an example. This could represent Kodiak, this picture, for example. And so they have storage hydro projects. So they have a natural battery, which is pretty awesome. They're kind of lucky in that respect, unlike Cordova. And they have 9 megawatts of wind energy, but they still have these, these fluctuations on their grid. And so one of the things that they had is they had an electric crane in the harbor. And this electric crane, and actually on the Golden Valley grid, this is sort of a similar situation with the Usabelli drag line, is that you have a really big, draw of current when you're loading that, and then when you're unloading it, you're actually putting it back on the grid. And so the flywheel sort of represents a power storage system, not really energy storage, but storing this amount of power so that you can both quickly feed something like an electric crane and then absorb that energy again when it's being unloaded. And so it really creates like better efficiencies on the grid. So they've done that. And the Kauai also has an electric cooperative. When I was there in Cordova working with them on some other projects and with their system, the Kauai cooperative was there and was learning from them about this particular application for how to use flywheels in conjunction with an electric crane, because they wanted to do a similar thing. So they were there kind of learning from Alaskans on how to do that effectively. Okay, yeah?
The challenge seems to be to balance the need for stability against the cost of achieving stability.
That's right. Engineers, like, you give us enough money and we can solve any problem.
I don't even know how to frame it, but we experienced, I used to work for LAS Scott at Pump Station 8, I don't know, 20 years ago, and you mentioned the Usabelli crane. When that thing came online, clear out on the other side of Eielson, the line became so unstable that it knocked us off and shut our popping unit down. And we solved it by disconnecting from Golden Valley. It was easy. But what are acceptable limits? The other extreme was we have a cabin with a solar system, and we don't care if power goes out.
Right.
So we're happy on an individual basis, but on a Alyeska basis, it wasn't real workable. What sort of I don't know, extremes, or how do you figure that out when it's worthwhile to spend more money? Are you working on that problem?
Yeah, we are. And I think that this is where, we work really closely with kind of playing that middle space between utilities and customers, whoever that customer is. And in this case, it's a mine. So actually, this is an example of a mine being a customer. I'll explain this in a second here. Another flywheel project, actually. But, at the end of the day, like, what you want from your utility company isn't necessarily the cheapest power. What you're actually looking for is reliable power. And so that means that utilities are by nature going to be fairly conservative in their business. they should be, because you may accept at your cabin that the lights are only on occasionally and there's not enough energy in your battery system at times because there wasn't enough solar, and that's fine for you. And that might be fine for people in sub-Saharan Africa too. But we expect that the lights are going to be on. And when the lights are off, that's sort of an unusual event, and we have a problem with that. And we call you, Steve, right? We used to. Look at you, like, look at a smile on your face. Not anymore. Yeah, it's a real balance. You know, it's a real balancing act. And then, you know, the utilities are being pushed more and more to come up with, like, you know, strategies for integrating renewables and things like that. But there's a cost to actually maintaining the grid. And I think customers need to change their thinking about that. So Hawaii right now is going to 100% renewables. But at the end of the day, there's still a service that needs to be paid for maintaining the grid and the kind of reliable power that we expect. So thinking about it more along the lines of, like, you're paying for when your phone, right? You're paying a flat rate every month for that service, and you just use it, right? It's commodity more, right? If the utility industry needs to sort of change the way that they're doing business, and consumers need to change the way they're thinking about how they're purchasing services from a utility, away from just the model of, like, I'm using this many kilowatt hours a month versus I am paying for the availability of the grid, you know?
Yeah. Is there any quantification of if we went, Golden Valley now is worried about windmills, I can't remember the numbers, but there's X amount of kW on their grid that they can accept from wind because beyond that affects stability. Going the other way, there's a whole bunch of residential customers like me. If the power goes out, big deal. I'm not affected. The hospital kind of has to have stable power, but I don't. Is there some way of getting that message out? Because if people accepted more instability, then more renewable wind, other sources are more viable.
Yeah, if you're willing to be an interruptible load for a utility, that provides value to all the other users, right? Because we can turn off your power when there's an inadequate supply. You're not going to complain, and you should be paying a lower rate because you're willing to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of those interruptible contracts, and that's kind of typical for large commercial users. But thinking about this on a more individual basis is actually something that's really being done a lot in Alaska. I love this conversation. I want to just put what do people say, put a pin in it or something like that, and actually talk about that when we show this video. It's only a 2-minute video, but that's exactly what they're doing in this community of Kongiganac. Is there's interruptible contracts with almost every resident in the community, not for electric power, but for heating. And that's the way they're able to balance their grid and get to well above 100% renewables on a tiny little grid, because the utility has these interruptible contracts for very cheap power with all these users, so they can dump excess power when they have it into heat loads, and when they don't, then they don't. And so it's pretty cool. And they ran, I think in January, they ran 7 days straight with no diesel, and at the same time offsetting a lot of heating loads for the community. And this is happening in a tiny little village in Alaska, and it's a pretty cool story. So I'll share that here in a minute. Okay, I'm just gonna go real fast. Okay, this is a flywheel we tested in our lab, and then it was installed in a remote mine in Canada. End of story. It's pretty cool. There was people from 7 different countries that were here in Fairbanks, again, spending money, spending hotel rooms here in a Fairbanks economy to test this flywheel at ASAP, because we had the facilities to do that. There was a lot of glitches. And this is really common when you have a new widget that you're trying to integrate into a system. In fact, when we first spun this flywheel up, the algorithms that the Hatch engineering had kind of developed, there was a glitch in them. They backfed our diesel generator, caused a complete blackout of the facility, right? So we kind of all got a good laugh about that and made them buy us a beer that night. But it wasn't a big deal in the lab, because that's what it's intended to do. If that same thing had happened at Raglan Mine in northern Quebec, that would have been a real serious problem, right? And so that's the kind of thing our lab does, and the feedback from Raglan Mine now is that that particular flywheel has been the most reliable part of their system, partially because of the systems integration testing that we did, but we also selected the inverter. We selected the packaging for them because we had knowledge over the right way to go about this. So, so that's the kind of thing that we do, and we're working very internationally on a lot of these problems. My first call this morning was at 6 a.m. with Iceland. We're working really closely with them, both on training programs, but they also have one diesel microgrid, and they want to turn that into a demonstration project, and they want Alaskans to mentor them on how to best go about that. That's pretty cool.
They're using hot water.
They use a lot of hot water. Yeah, they're really, kind of the poster child globally for integrating renewables, which is why I give them a hard time about having a diesel grid, because I say, well, they say, well, it's kind of far away from, it's remote, and I'm like, that's why, because they say, why in Alaska do you not have a grid everywhere? You should have a grid that just goes to every community in Alaska. And I say, the distances are really big, the economics don't work out, and they say, they don't understand that, right? But then they have this one island offshore that's 20 miles offshore. Why aren't you connected to me? It's too far away and the economics don't work out. Okay, exactly. So this is kind of our grid. Okay, now Steve's gonna look at it and be like, yeah, there's a couple things missing here, but you kind of get the idea. So so that's sort of our rail belt transmission grid. And one of the things that I want to be thinking about, we've been talking a lot about these rural communities, but this is really an Alaskan energy paradigm thing, and so when you look at Fairbanks, you've got the UAF grid, right? That's a microgrid that's connected or nested within the Golden Valley grid, right? The same thing, you've got, bases that have different abilities to island or not island, or self-generate. The Fairbanks area itself can isolate from Anchorage, and in fact, often does get isolated, whether we like it or not, from the Anchorage area, and that's part of why the BESS exists here in Fairbanks, which at the time it was installed was the largest battery system in the world, and it's been pretty successful in terms of offsetting brownouts and short-term outages for this Fairbanks microgrid. And when you look at the rest of it, similarly, the Matanuska Electric Association, their grid is essentially islanded and started as like literally a microgrid that then was connected, to these other grids over time. This is kind of our rail belt grid in terms of the way we look from the ability to isolate a particular subsection of that grid. So we've got a lot of different microgrids that are sort of linked and interconnected, and that's just the way we do business in Alaska. When you look at the top 10 states for microgrid install capacity, Alaska, dwarfs everybody else. So we're not just big in size, we're also really big in terms of like what we've done with microgrids. And a really cool thing about this is actually install capacity on microgrids. This isn't just number of microgrids, this is actually the amount of generation that's installed on these microgrids. And in this case, they're sort of defining microgrids. This is Navigant research, and so they're defining microgrids as having to have multiple generation sources with at least one being from renewables connected to that grid. So we fit that definition for our grid. But
is the causation of those other states' microgrids tend to be topography? Therefore, it's difficult to get a connection.
No.
Whether it's mountains or water.
No. The big advantage for microgrids in other markets is about resiliency. The thing that a microgrid can offer you is a more resilient grid. It's not necessarily more reliable, it's more resilient. And those are two really different things. So basically, if you have, who said the hospital needs to have power? You said that, right? Yeah. So there are always places where you want to have the lights come back on right away. It might go out, the lights might go out for a minute, but you need to know you can get the lights back on, even if the larger grid is still out. And yeah, absolutely. And so clearly this is a strategy that's done for like kind of critical infrastructure all over the place and has been for a long time. But when you sort of expand that to more of like a distribution network around a particular community or a campus or something like that, then you start to look at that as a microgrid. Navigant says if it's just diesel generators, it's not a microgrid. It has to have like renewables connected to it. Otherwise, there'd be like 5 gajillion uncountable number of microgrids. And so it's got to be like larger than one facility, and it's got to have renewables connected at a grid level. So a couple solar panels on a house doesn't necessarily count. So Alaska does really well in this metric. And I've been like really making the case, as Brian knows, that Alaska is a real leader in this area. Around the Arctic, this is the typical paradigm, right? So every single red dot represents a community that's served by an isolated microgrid, and then the dark gray blobs are regional grids, like our rail belt grid, that are sort of that are isolated from any kind of a larger national or continental grid. And then the lighter gray area on the margins, that represents the northern sort of limit of our continental grid infrastructure. And so in this area represents 20% of the world's landmass, right? 20% is not electrically connected in the Arctic. And so across the Arctic, this is a really common paradigm. And Alaska is the leader within the Arctic region in terms of integrating renewables. A lot of the reason for that is that we actually have really minimal subsidies. So there's a lot less sort of economic distortion, market distortion in Alaska compared to other markets where there's a higher subsidy for electric power and there's less incentive to switch to other sources. Yeah?
So Gwen, you say that Alaska is the leader, but it looks like Russia by sheer size.
They have a lot more diesel-based grids.
Okay.
So I'm talking about integrating renewables.
How are they integrating with you in some of this? Or?
Oh, a lot actually. There's a lot of dialogue, and actually Russia's done some pretty interesting things. Like for example, the Sakha Republic, which is sort of this. Can I control this? Like in this area of Russia here, it's really big. We cannot compete with them on cold. They're colder than us in the winter. And they're twice as big as Alaska. So like we have no street cred with them at all. They can say, if we divide the Sakha Republic in half, then Alaska would be, you know, like that. So, but anyway, they're actually really leading in solar energy in the Arctic. They have the largest solar installation north of the Arctic Circle in Badagai, a little remote reindeer herding village, a 1 megawatt system, which by lower 48 standards is not very big, but by Arctic, like high Arctic standards, is quite large. And so we've like been sharing information with them about foundation design in permafrost environments and things like that. So there's a lot of like local interest, and there's been a lot of exchange and dialogue between that region and here. And in fact, you know, we have a sister city. Fairbanks has a sister city in what is it? Yakutsk. Yeah. And so we actually went there, and they have a renewable energy conference there that we've worked with them on for several years. Yeah. So there's interesting things happening there.
You mentioned subsidies before, just briefly, and I find that very problematic because that's what keeps the price of entry down. Mm-hmm. And with Alaska not having any subsidies, your price of entry is huge. They're trying to put in any kind of significant project is, well, who's going to pay for it? And trying to keep the electric price down at GVEA, at the same time trying to integrate a significant renewable, whether it be a wind farm or a solar farm, which has to be supplemented because your base load goes up and down. Without state subsidies, it's incredibly expensive. So you go to outside money to go fund it, but those guys want their return on investment. Yep. So that brings the price of electricity up to 16 cents a kilowatt hour, and everybody is screaming because right now it's really at 10 to 11. And so why don't we just have everybody's bill go up by 25%? Without those subsidies, though, I find that implementation becomes very difficult.
That's right, and so that you're exactly right. A lot of this kind of comes down to economics, and like in the Fairbanks market, you have a certain set of pressures that you're working under. But when you go to a place like, for example, Hughes, he left, right?
JP left.
So, you know, I'm going to guess that the price for electric power in Hughes is about 80 cents. So then someone like Matt Carter comes in and says, you know what, I can beat 80 cents. No problem. I don't need a subsidy, right? But then it's also our job to remind Matt that, hey, it's not actually 80 cents that's your boogeyman, because part of that is not fuel costs. And you can't affect the fact that it costs a certain amount to run a utility in a rural community. So think about it as more back of the envelope, like half of that is a cost that you might consider your boogeyman. So can you beat 40 cents a kilowatt hour? Yeah, right? So then how can you like start to think about how a project makes sense? Then it comes down to the integration question. It's not firm wind, right? So how can you take a resource like that and firm it up, and who pays for that? So these are like really, really interesting questions that that we want to work on, because actually we get we really understand the utility model and paradigm, and we get the pressure that they're under. On one hand, you want in Hawaii, for example, 100%. We work with Hawaii a lot. 100% renewables. Oh, but we don't want it. We're paying way too much, right? You know, there people need to make choices. Everything is about choices. Maybe someone wants to pay more for renewables, but there's a cost associated with it. Somebody has to pay, you know? And so people need to understand that, and that's an education thing that I think people don't understand. So you guys, yes, Steve.
One more piece of that puzzle. We go from 80 cents to 40 cents. PCE is still paying down the face.
Yes, yes.
If you can't beat 20 cents, your bill doesn't go down.
That's exactly right. So this is where we need to educate communities to understand this. So people think, got wind turbines, now my bill is going to go down. Am I going to pay less per kilowatt hour? But actually, the subsidy for residential users gets washed away by the subsidy that we do have for our rural communities, this power cost equalization. So they see no decrease in their bill, right? So then you say, well, how does this work, right? But in Alaska, 2/3 of the kilowatt hours, again, I'm doing rule of thumb here, in most rural communities is not eligible for the power cost equalization program. So those users do see an immediate reduction in their bill if you're offsetting fuel for those communities. And then if you can get to a point where you're actually offsetting heat, which is a much bigger energy user for most of our communities, including here in Fairbanks, than electric power is, now you're really kind of making having some impact. And that's where I'm like hoping that we get to watch the video for us. This is the total installed capacity. There's not actually numbers here. These are just percentages. I love the fact that I have Antarctica in there, but there are actually microgrids in Antarctica, clearly. So, you know, if you look at this, Alaska, remember, is 50% of the North American market. Actually, that's the U.S. market. And I don't think there's that many in Canada. So let's just call it 15% is Alaska. So if you look at it that way, you know, we are really, you know, have a pretty big impact from here in Alaska in this particular technology space, and we have a lot of experience and expertise in this area. We're already kind of exporting a lot of that knowledge to other markets, and one of the things that we're trying to do, and we've been working with Brian on a bit, is really like figuring out how we can more actively work together as Alaskans to understand what expertise we actually have and figure out how we can actually market this sort of expertise to help support projects development in other places. Yeah.
I've got a question. You mentioned batteries several times. Mm-hmm. They're a very major part of the cost of both wind and sun. But there's new technology out. Have you been doing any research on? There's supposedly some new technology with solid electrolyte and plastic batteries, they're called, that have escalated really the capacity, mm-hmm. the charging time, the whole thing, way beyond what anybody ever thought existed. Mm-hmm. Has there been any research on any of those batteries? Yeah, is there any validity to that?
Is there any validity? Yeah, so that's another perfect example of like where we are really trying to understand sort of the state of, you know, the industry or some particular area, and storage is an area where I think there's clearly there's a big stumbling block for us is the expense of storage, and then also like whether the battery systems can actually live up to the, you know, the specifications that the manufacturer says that they're designed to live up to. So one example of that, I'm not going to answer specific questions about plastic. You know, this is not my area of expertise, but one example is that there was a liquid metal battery. I really like this one. So basically it was like designed to have a limitless number of cycles, because essentially for those of you, I don't know if any of you are familiar with like aluminum smelting, but the reason why aluminum is a really high value recyclable material is because it takes a lot of energy to make aluminum to kind of create pure aluminum from an alloy, right? And so you can do that chemical reaction the other way around. You can create an alloy and it can actually generate heat, okay? And then you can use that to make electric power. So there was this liquid metal battery that was heated to like 450 Celsius, and it was like an aluminum alloy that then would like dissociate and associate, and that's how you would get energy in and out of the battery, and it was freaking really awesome. And it was insulated, you know, so you had to like, but once it was all heated up, it actually didn't take a lot of energy to keep it heated, as long as you were exercising the battery. And it was designed by MIT, and it was like the hot idea maybe 5 years ago or something like that. And and it worked at the benchtop model, but it hadn't been scaled up. And so we got a grant to test out the technology in our lab in Alaska. But we worked with that manufacturer back and forth, and we eventually deemed that it was not mature enough to be ready for like an actual application in the field. And so we actually turned back 100% of that grant money untouched, because we want to be good stewards of our public dollars. And that was actually to the Alaska Energy Authority, I think. So we turned back that entire grant. But we're always looking at like, what are better ways that we can do things, both incrementally, and then are there some real like complete, you know, changes in our paradigm. That's why we're interested in like Matt Carter's wind turbine, because it's a tilt-up tower. One of the big challenges in rural Alaska is bringing a crane in, maybe having to leave it for an entire year. That raises the cost a lot. If you have a tilt-up tower for both initial installation and long-term maintenance, that's interesting, right? So what are other ways that his technology could be sort of hardened or improved for this sort of niche market? Which we think, and he thinks, I think, is bigger than most people recognize, because it's not just about the Arctic and Alaska, but it's a lot of remote areas in the world that could benefit from technologies that local labor can do more to install and maintain. Yeah, but that's what we're trying. So if anyone in this room ever like trips across some like really interesting technology, Doug Isaacson, you should come to us, and we're happy to like kind of take a look at it, give you our impression, because we try to kind of be that clearinghouse of interesting ideas and information. So
Good, thank you.
Yeah. We have a lot of systems in Alaska. Done. Okay.
One looks at geothermal.
Yeah, there's one of those on there somewhere. Yeah, something like that. The more you integrate variable renewables, the harder and more complicated systems get, and the more expensive things get. End of story. Okay. We have a lot of systems installed in Alaska. Okay. But actually, interestingly, like what I think is kind of fascinating is how much wind we have actually in Alaska, and how successfully we've been able to do wind, notwithstanding the fact that there's been lots of challenges in lots of small ways with a lot of systems in the state, including with Eva Creek. We actually are finding ways to make wind successful in this state over long periods of time. A lot of these systems have been installed for over a decade now, and it's actually pretty cool, because other countries are trying to figure out how Alaska is doing that. Because I just spoke with the Greenlanders are looking to Alaska for remote community solutions, and they installed a wind turbine and lost a blade within a month. So they're like, why, what's going on? So we're doing a bunch of like kind of back and forth with them right now to figure out like what their failure mechanisms and modes were, because we're not having always the same issue. So there's questions like, is their wind regime like highly different and more turbulent and things like that. So we're working with the Nukitsiofit is the utility in Greenland, and we work really closely with them on a lot of this stuff. That's it. But I want to show the video. Yeah. Okay, it's really short. And
Where's this?
oh, that's Kodiak. That's actually Kodiak. Yep. So let's see here. Right
I'm
here.
surprised you don't know that, Mike.
I think he did know that. He just was testing me. Oh, okay, good. So I don't know if we have sound, and we don't need to, because I decided to pick the one Amanda. This is Concagenax. This is a community of about 600 people. Amanda could actually say this, but I'm just going to do it really quickly. She took all the footage here. This is a drone that we flew around the community. It kind of shows the housing. You guys are pretty much from Alaska, so I'm not going to give you know what a sewage lagoon is. You know, this is a community without running water and without a modern sewage system. They have no cars there. It's all boardwalks because they're on tundra, so you can't have a vehicle there. So
Population in the hundreds.
there. Yeah, 600 and growing. And so subsistence, high subsistence lifestyle activities there. Amanda took, like I said, all this footage. This is just while she was out there in the community. Really interesting place. So they installed these Windmatic wind turbines. This is not like the top state-of-the-art technology or anything like that, but they are systems that the local community operators can fix because you can fix them with a wrench, so they're not necessarily the most modern thing, but you can see the operators up there and they're resetting the brakes on those turbines, you know, after, you know, after a wind event, a high wind event. So these are local people that have been trained to do this. There's a lot of different community members that are part of this project. There's probably 10 or so part-time jobs in the community from this project, and it's designed by an Alaska company that's working kind of all over the world really now. And so what they're doing is they're taking this wind energy and they're displacing excess wind energy into thermal stoves in individual homes. So this is where they're turning on and off loads in individual residences, heating loads. They're charging 10 cents a kilowatt hour for the electric power for heating, and they have a small battery system that's essentially what you'd find in a car, like a Chevy, you know, Leaf or something like that, and an inverter system, and they can turn the diesel engine off. So Amanda, if you had sound here, we would hear there's no diesel running in the power plant in this particular case. And so this is a really, I think, a pretty cool story because the community has really taken ownership of this project. They make this happen. They've displaced about 60% of their fuel oil using wind energy. So this is diesel off of. It's diesel off, we don't hear it. So there's no sound in the power plant other than people hammering and things like that. And I think it's a pretty cool story, and it's just a local community that's been that's kind of worked with other communities to kind of come up with a strategy. And I view these guys as doing some of the most cutting edge things in the world from a pretty rural platform in Alaska. And I think these are stories that we want to share. So this is kind of where Amanda went to the community, and we, by the way, were not involved with the design of this system per se, but we're trying to figure out, we're trying to understand the cost, because the community members tell us that they're saving a significant amount on heating fuel, and that they really feel like this is a huge benefit to them. The amount of fuel oil that they're selling in the community compared to gasoline has dramatically shifted. They used to sell more fuel oil. Now there's more gasoline being sold than fuel oil. People are using the extra savings to actually do more subsistence activities in the community. So we're trying to actually quantify that and see if we can kind of capture those ancillary benefits to projects, because those are hard to count sometimes. It's hard to say, wow, if you can have people live more traditional lifestyles and be able to get out on the land more and do more subsistence harvest, there's a value to that, a social value that's pretty hard to capture. So, you know, how can you think about things that way in terms of the cost-benefit analysis that you might do on energy systems? So I just thought I'd share that. This is one of many stories, and Amanda has them all on our website, and they're all in like little easily digestible, like 5-minute videos. And again, it's not necessarily about projects that ASAP's involved in, but it's Alaskan stories that we're trying to share more broadly, because there's some cool ones out there. And not just energy, but also food. I like the edible classrooms, pretty cool. And actually farming in Bethel, tundra farming. There's all kinds of really cool stories. There's so many inspirational things happening in Alaska, and so check them out on our website if you want to. There's like a little thing, a little bar that says community website, or community videos, right, Amanda? Yeah.
When was that done? When did they finish the project? And
It's been iterative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They just put in they put in the wind turbines probably like 6 years ago, and then they put in the first 20 thermal stoves a few years after that, and then last year they finished with another 30 thermal stoves. And so they have, I think there's 170 homes in Kongiganack, and they have 50 thermal stoves in there, which is amazing.
And then
How were the turbines financed?
So a lot of these projects were initially financed under the Renewable Energy Fund. This project was actually largely funded in partnership with the borough as well. So it actually had like very much multiple sources of funding. I think there was some Department of Energy funding in there as well. One thing that I think is interesting is that the Renewable Energy Fund has not really had any significant level of funding for the last several years, but we actually haven't seen the number of projects being developed decline much. And I actually want to have some data behind that. That's one thing I'm going to start to like actually try to get some numbers behind, because I think it's interesting that the Renewable Energy Fund created this huge spike in the number of projects that were developed, but now that that program's not really being funded anymore, we haven't necessarily seen a dramatic drop.
That was grant money rather than loan?
It was grant money, yep.
So there's no amortization to that at all. It's an expensive.
This project was not necessarily largely funded through that. There were some aspects that were funded, but yeah, there absolutely. You know, this question about public dollars and the use of public dollars and how we should be investing and what makes sense. You know, there's a lot of good questions around that, and this is why part of why Alaska's done so many projects in so many places is because we have this really interesting utility market too. We have over 100 utilities, like certificated utilities in the state of Alaska, which is pretty unusual for a market of our size. And a lot of that is because we do have all these small individual grids. So Conkiganek has its own utility company that just serves that community. So they don't care if you go and install a project somewhere else that's saving more money. They want to impact their community, you know. So that's part of why we do things the way we do. Whereas in Canada, it's mostly like kind of crown corporations, larger quasi-governmental utilities, and the motivations are different. Yeah.
So just so for the record there online, again, here's the ASAP website, and so are these those resources you were talking about?
Yeah.
The community videos, and it just takes you to a YouTube link, and you can view any of the videos. There's a whole bunch of them. I watched Seth Kantner teach some kids how to make pickled herring, which was kind of fun.
Go ahead, Doug.
So how is all that is happening at COG? How's that affecting the non-PCEs? How's that helping to develop a cash economy for them?
Yeah, I mean those are really good questions. So the non-PCE users in the community are seeing a direct benefit because the fuel cost has gone down actually pretty significantly. So that portion of what they're paying is decreasing. Now, is it going to zero? No, because they're still using diesel, right? I mean, the reality is that diesel is still going to be an element in these systems for a pretty long time, maybe until microreactors become like ubiquitous. I don't know, you know. So, you know, that's just something to kind of recognize that you're never going to get that number to zero. The fixed cost of operating a utility isn't going to change, and so there's just a limit to how low you can go, and people need to kind of understand that. So the question is, though, that if you how much value is there in if the energy costs go way up again, like double, the fuel prices double in a year like they did in 2008, and they're not as affected by that, how much value is there to that, right? And we're not really placing a value on that all the time today, you know.
Roger.
Yeah, Gwen, it's very interesting. On geothermal, of course, Bernie Carl's done a fantastic job out there.
She did that.
Yeah, right. He's been at the forefront on a lot of things. On Circle Hot Springs, is there enough hot water there to potentially develop something there? You know, there's
Absolutely.
not much.
Yeah, there's nothing.
Economy, right.
The cool thing about China is that there's nothing like super remarkable about that system. It was actually like just like a lot of these other interior systems. So the challenge with Circle Hot Springs, and I've thought about it a lot, is that you have plenty of thermal energy there for the hot side. What you don't have, and China had, was access to cold water. And so a big part of the China equation was having access to a nearby cold water source. I think at Circle, you could definitely do something in terms of figuring out a way to access a cold water supply, but that's something that needs to be thought about, or you use cold air. Yeah. And once you use cold air and you use a lot of, you know, fans, and your parasitic load goes up and efficiency on one of these like really low temperature geothermal systems is really low to start with. So you kind of need to protect every kilowatt hour that you can get. And one of the really cool things that I was proud of with the Chena Hot Springs project is that we siphoned the cooling water out of an infiltration gallery and ran 3,000 gallons a minute through the cooling side with no pump. And that really made a pretty big difference. Yeah.
Mike? I think I heard that the governor cut PCE out of the budget. How's that going to affect? It seems like renewables will really get a boost.
Didn't they put that back in?
I understood that the governor cut the PCE out of the
weren't they
budget.
gonna put that back in the legislature?
In the House.
Of course, we haven't seen that.
So we haven't seen the conclusion yet.
He didn't cut PCs, he just took the funds, the pool of money.
The
So that
endowment.
The legislature has to redo it like they did in the old days.
Yeah.
Right.
And what about the line item veto? Never mind, that's not.
Well, that's after the legislature gets through with it.
It seems to me we're looking at a similar, every time we have a presentation from the university, which we're all supportive of that up there. But the takeaway that would be nice to have, we've got several people that have been to Juneau and shown the first trees, for funding. It would be and I don't know how hard it would be to do, because you'd have a lot of intangibles like you mentioned, right? But if there's some way you could have a visual that could be taken to those guys down in Juneau, to show them exactly the kind of monies that your organization, something that's going to appeal to the private sector, to see there's a value here because we can see the dollars and cents they brought to the state, that they're saving. I mean, all these things that we talk about in vague terms, there's any way you could articulate that into something people could see, then we could show it to those ding-dongs down in Juneau, no offense, local guys here.
Like an Avengers movie or something.
Well, something to show that the money being created, you know. It's very always lacking. We know there's a value there intrinsically, but they need to see something. Anyway, that's just a thought I had.
Yeah, and it's,
Got
yeah.
too much common sense.
Well, yeah, that's it, I'm sorry.
It's a good point, and part of the issue is that there's just so many partners involved. So you mentioned Chena Hot Springs, you know, so yeah, I worked at Chena when we developed those projects. We worked heavily with the university, right? The university, not ASAP, it didn't exist at that time, but the university supported that project heavily. Okay, does the university say, well, the project would have never happened without us? I mean, you can't say that, right? So how do you really, like, do you claim all these projects, right? So if we claim, well, Kongiganac is our story, there's going to be people that have a problem with that because we're playing a supporting role. So it's sort of this, like, difficult thing, you know, you can put stars on a map and show all the places our projects are, but we need people to tell stories about how it impacts them. And I think that's why I like Amanda as a chief storyteller, and every single one of you probably has some story about the university, and I think at the end of the day, what's going to resonate isn't like a dollars and cents number so much, but like really like how it impacts people. And
we're in a dollar and cents time right now, and your survival is based upon justifying, you know, from a dollar and cents point of view. So I subscribe totally to the philosophy behind it, but it's still, you know, leave it to somebody else to disprove your facts, but the facts out there. That's what everybody's doing out here.
Let me grab an editorial moment here. Save Our University is an effort that started here a week ago. It got the chamber and
Board behind you.
yeah, a number of people and a number of reasons, but you know, but what Gwen's talked about today and her point that, you know, the university does, you know, phenomenal things beyond education, and of course they do education, and that's important for all of us that have organizations that we need to bring educated people into work. But you know, to drive Alaska towards Alaska's future is what, you know, I really think of the university, and Gwen and her organization are doing that, working in that every day, you know, in energy and other ways. If you're interested, you know, you can go online and it says join our team. There's, you know, our goal is 10,000 supporters by the middle of May. That's a pretty lofty goal. There's people out there. I noticed, you know, we're getting criticism. I'm getting criticized for doing it. There's people out there that absolutely want their dividend. I cannot imagine how Alaska is going to survive if our budget is predicated on the gallons and price of oil coming out of the ground every year. It is just not going to work. We are not gonna survive. And so, you know, join our team, come on board. Gwen, thank you. Sorry to steal your thunder here. Thank you for coming, and when we do appreciate what you do, and we appreciate your organization and you know, your contribution to Alaska. Thank you. And thank you.
Just go to the Chamber of Commerce's website, and it's under the Advocacy tab. It's the very first item under their Advocacy tab.
Are you looking for money, is that it?
No money, just.
Yes.
Well,
So get together on that.
I mean, listen to John.
Get your checkbook out.
Well, and we don't have a lofty financial goal. We're trying to raise $20,000 to, you know, to do things like
get
bumper
things done.
stickers and a little bit of advertising to get.
Just get things done.
Yeah.
But first things first, is just, again,
Put me on.
putting your name on the list. So just, again, go to the site. If you own a business, again, you can say, yes, you may use our name. Yes, you may use the name of our business, or no. If you'd like to be, or make yourself available for further action, should further action be asked, there's a button you can push for that. But again, let's start with first things first and seeing if we can't rustle up 10,000 folks by May 15th who are willing to, you know, put their name on a list as supporters.
Okay, well, thanks again, and Gwen, thank you. Amanda, thank you. You know, great presentation, and you know, obviously, it shows Alaska's interest in, you know, in Alaska's problems and future solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good.
Good job.
Yeah.
The biggest crowd we've had.
I know. I was like, oh.
One question we did,
Sure.
Gwen,
Yeah.
one question, well, we're off the record here, but.
Well, hold on, let me get off the record.
Okay. Crazy. Well, no, nothing crazy. I was just gonna ask about